If you've ever shopped around for a phone and looked at its specifications, one word would probably come up in a lot of them: octa-core. This is so ubiquitous that everything from budget phones below $100 to flagships that cost over 10 times more contain this same descriptor. But what exactly does that mean? Is it actually a meaningful indicator of performance? And why do so many phones have them? In the land of CPUs, there are generally two measurable specifications that determine the performance of a particular piece of silicon. Clock speed, that's how fast the transistors in a chip are switching, and core counts, how many processing units are actually inside the chip. I've already talked about clock speeds before, mostly in the context of x86, but they still mostly hold true for ARM CPUs. So let's talk a bit more about core count. A processor is really just a bunch of transistors arranged in many different types of switches that make up logic and compute units, and then some memory to store the bits they need to process. In the old days, this was what all a CPU is. But the need for ever faster computing power pushed the limits of what these rudimentary single compute unit CPUs can handle without becoming extremely inefficient. And by the dawn of the 21st century, it simply wasn't enough. This is when people have found out a way to increase performance aside from just making the transistors switch faster. Just have more of them. Think of it this way. Tasks that the CPU needs to process can be broken up into instructions that are then arranged in a queue to be processed by that CPU. The faster the clock speed, the faster that queue moves, and the faster that group of instructions that form a task can be completed. But what if we can split that task up by introducing another processing unit? All of a sudden, the processing power available to a CPU has essentially doubled, and it can now process different tasks simultaneously, or a task can even be broken up into instructions that can be processed in two different queues simultaneously, having the time you would need to complete that task without increasing clock speeds. This is the fundamental concept of multi-core designs. Have many different queues that can process many instructions at the same time, allowing many tasks to run together, or a task to be broken up and done in a fraction of the time required. As I said in the clock speed video, this new emphasis in parallelized computing has paid dividends, as clock speeds have essentially stagnated in the last few decades, thanks to the death of the NARD's scaling. For example, in desktop x86, maximum clock speeds increased by just 40% since the end of the Pentium 4 era, while core counts have climbed by over 8 times, with most of the increase happening within the last 5 years due to increased competition. The same is true for mobile ARM SoCs. Since 2015, these have mostly been octa-cores, meaning that they contain 8 processing cores in them. All of these phones at varying price points are octa-core SoCs and have more cores than my laptop. Yet run them all through something like Geekbench, and as you would intuitively expect, they all have very different performance characteristics, with only the S21 Plus 5G with a flagship grade Exynos 2100 actually being faster than my laptop, which has, in theory, half the cores of all these freaking phones. What gives? Well, not all cores are created equal. I touched on this before, but aside from the raw clock speed, there are other determinants of performance that can't be easily measured, the biggest of which is IPC, or instructions per clock. Think back to the cue from earlier. I made it sound like a processor can only do one instruction at a time. Back then, they used to. But as processors became more complex, they have been able to process more than one instruction per clock cycle. IPC varies depending on the core's microarchitecture, or the structure in which it processes information. You can see this clearly demonstrated in our single-core Geekbench results, where the Exynos pulls ahead much further than the raw clock speeds would seem to suggest. But looking at the multi-core scores again, we see that while the Exynos still pulls out way ahead, it doesn't actually scale very well compared to its single-core performance. Now we're getting into the root of this. For starters, not every core or cluster of cores are always clocked the same. The Helio P35 on my phone, for example, can theoretically clock its A53 cores as high as 2.3 GHz, at least on 4 of them. If you hit the SoC with an all-core load, the other 4 can only clock to as high as 1.8 GHz, which means that it won't scale to 8 times its single-threaded performance. Side note here, unless you're running a perfectly parallelized test, you will almost never see a true perfect performance scaling. There is a point of diminishing returns. But that also doesn't explain everything. To go deeper, we need to go into the heart of ARM SoC design. CPUs have different microarchitectures that are designed for different purposes. Some are big, power-hungry, high-performance cores, while others are designed to be smaller, slower, or more efficient. This focus towards certain balances in performance and efficiency means that these cores on their own aren't as flexible as their more generally constructed x86 counterparts, but it also means that the SoCs can be designed much more flexibly. How? Mixing and matching, of course. Heterogeneous computing is the concept of combining many different kinds of processing units, in this case different CPU cores, in order to achieve a certain target for performance, efficiency, and die size. For all of you who already know what all of this is and have been angrily waiting, this is when I introduce ARM's Big Little design, where a few high-performance big cores are mixed with a bunch of efficient little cores. This is why 8 cores on a phone aren't all the same, because the combination of those 8 can vary wildly. But why would it be better to do it this way instead of just doing it like traditional x86, where you have all general design cores in a package? ARM SoCs are in a very different market than most x86 CPUs. They are almost unanimously used in applications where efficiency is a higher priority than raw performance. Things like phones, laptops, and even servers that have to run hundreds of them, so you have to save as much on the power bill as possible. This means that power efficiency is at the heart of ARM design, and to achieve the utmost, you have to get creative. Find a way to minimize the most power-hungry components and replace them with power-sipping ones whenever possible. Remember the concept of multi-core in the first place, to do more tasks at once or to accelerate tasks by splitting them up? Well, much like cores, not every task is equal. Some need high performance to run their best, while others can just sit idly by in the background until the user needs to do something with it. And even then, it probably won't need the same amount of power. The distinction between high priority foreground tasks and lower priority background tasks is why Big Little works so well in ARM. Not every task is going to need 8 fast cores. They just need a couple, leaving the rest just sitting there, wasting power. Even with tricks like power gating and super low standby, just having big cores there sitting is going to be inefficient in both power and die size, and especially when they handle the background junk you're running. Those crap don't need high performance cores, so it's better to just throw them to slower, more efficient ones. And in situations where you need full multi-core grunt, well, you still have the sheer amount of cores available to you, even if some of them aren't as fast. So long as the correct tasks lands in the correct core, which will be heavily dependent on the operating system's task scheduler, this will result in a good balance of performance and efficiency. Which begs the question, doesn't it? Why 8? When octa-core SoCs first appeared in the market in 2015, there were some debate on whether or not they were actually necessary from their quad-core predecessors, given that most tasks don't scale above a few cores. Of course, it stuck around. to the point where almost every modern phone SoC are built on an 8-core configuration. The biggest reason, I think, is that the flexibility and versatility of organizing cores in this configuration is just much higher. Most tasks don't scale above a few cores still, and background tasks don't really consume that much power anyhow. Bottom line then, due to the way cores work in hybrid CPUs, the number of cores are no longer an indicator of performance. It's how those cores are arranged that makes the difference, and given the many different configurations, predicting how they would perform is extremely difficult even if you have the actual CPU specs. Octa-core really doesn't mean anything anymore, and consumers should keep that in mind, as the sum of 8 can be very different from each other.